In this video, we're going to continue with our discussion of relationships. Specifically, we're going to look at associative entities, which are also known as bridge or intersection entities. So an associative entity is a combination of a relationship and an entity. So when do we create an associative entity? There's two cases where you will always create an associative entity. Wherever you see a many-to-many relationship, then we must create an associative entity. Also, wherever you see a ternary or more than 3 entities that are involved in a relationship, we need an associative entity there as well. Additionally, associative entities have other characteristics, such as a unique identifier and other attributes, and it typically has independent meaning separate from the entities that created the relationship in the first place. So let's look at an example of an associative entity. So here we have a binary relationship between employee and course. An employee could complete many courses. A course is completed by one-to-many employees. And then we have the verb, the relationship type of completes. We also have attributes of the relationship such as completed. So this would be the date when an employee completed the course. So to represent this using an associative entity, what we're going to do is drop an entity right between employee and course. So as you can see here, we have the entity of certificate that now bridges between employee and course. Notice that since this is an associative entity, it has rounded corners instead of square corners like the normal entities. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the original relationship between employee and course. So employee completes 0 to many courses. So I'm going to start again at employee and say employee completes 0 to many courses. I'm going to attach that cardinality to the certificate, although the original cardinality is associated with the course, not with the certificate. Then I'm going to go to course and say a course is completed by 1 to many employees. So going back here, I say a course is completed by 1 to many employees, and this cardinality is going to touch the certificate associative entity, as you can see here. Now, for the purposes of this class, we're going to use mandatory ones on the other sides. So the employee side and the course side is going to have a mandatory 1. This is not always the case. The time that this would be optional is if you had a foreign key, which could be null. And we'll talk about that in subsequent videos. Additionally, each associative entity must have an identifier, just like our original entities. So there are 2 different ways to create an identifier. One is take the identifiers of the entities that made up the relationship in the first place, so an employee ID and course ID, and together they'd become a composite identifier. An alternative that you could do is just create your own surrogate identifier. So in this case, we could just say certificate ID, and that would be sufficient. Let's look at an example of a ternary relationship now. So here we have a vendor that supplies a part to a warehouse. There's many-to-many relationships involved. We have an attribute of the relationship of shipping mode. So we're going to slap an associative entity in the middle of these 3 entities. Again, with rounded corners. It's all mandatory many on all of these sides. So we're going to say a vendor mandatory many to the shipment, mandatory many part to the shipment, and mandatory many warehouse to the shipment. Now we'll take each one of these identifiers from the original entities that made up the relationship, and we'll add them all together, and together they will become the identifier of this associative entity. Alternatively, we could have just used shipment ID as our identifier. So now what I want you to do is pause this video, try to create the associative entity that should exist here on your own, and then come back and compare your answer. All right, welcome back. So what we're going to do is take an associative entity and slap it between order and product, as you can see here. And as you can see on the left side, we have an order contains 1 to many products. So we're going to continue with that. An order contains 1 to many products, and that's going to be attached to the order line entity. And then we have a product is part of 0 to many orders. And this product is part of 0 to many orders connected to the order line. We're going to use mandatory ones for the purposes of this class. And then we give each relationship its relationship type. And then this attribute that was part of the relationship becomes an attribute of the associative entity as it was an attribute of the relationship. For additional exercise with associative entities, I want you to take our previous learning activity and identify where we would need to include the associative entities, and then identify if there's any attributes of the relationship, and then convert the relationship to include an associative entity. So pause the video, try this on your own, and then come back to compare your answer. All right, welcome back. So where do we need to include an associative entity? Well, we need to include an associative entity between coach and player because we have a many-to-many relationship, and between player and game because we have a many-to-many relationship. So between player and game, I'm going to create an associative entity. I'm going to do my best to round the edges here. And I'll connect them with a straight line between player and game to that. For the relationship, a player plays in 0 to many games, so I'm going to put 0 to many there, and I'll just put mandatory 1 on this side. And then a game has 1 to many players, so we'll go ahead and put 1 to many on that side, and then I'll just use the mandatory 1 on this side. And then a player plays in 0 to many games, and a game has 1 to many players. So as for attributes of this associative entity, we have several things that are going to take place. So a player is playing in a game. What happens during that game? Well, they make shots, they have hits, they have steals, they have rebounds, and they have blocks and many other statistics that we gather. Now notice that in our player table we had these as derived attributes. So the actual instance of where these occur are in each game that that player plays in. So we're going to record each one of these statistics, and then from that we can have a query that will calculate all these as they pertain to a particular player, so we know the total shots, total hits, total steals, total rebounds, and total blocks for that specific player. All right, so what are we going to name this associative entity? What I like to do is, if I can't come up with a good name for the table, I just take the two entities together. So player underscore game would be one thing, or it could be game statistic. So either way works for me. It doesn't really matter the name, just use something and be consistent. So we'll just go ahead and put player game for right now. Now we said that each entity and each associative entity must have an identifier. So do any of these fill in as an identifier? No. So let's go ahead, since I'm running out of room, I'll just write it on the right side here. We're going to put game ID, which comes from the entity that made up the relationship, or one of the entities that made up the relationship, and player ID, which is the other entity that made up the relationship, and the two of these together would then become our identifier. We would do the same thing over here for coach, so I'm going to go ahead and draw another associative entity, and we'll go ahead and connect these, and we'll name this player coach. All right, so it's a one-to-many on both sides, so we'll just go ahead and put the one-to-many on both sides of the associative entity, add our mandatory ones. And then we can say coach coaches, and the player is coached by. All right, for attributes of this, well, let's go ahead and include our identifiers this time first. So we'll do coach ID and player ID. Again, you could have used a surrogate for this or for the player table as well. And together they will be our identifier. And what are some of the attributes here? Well, if you can't think of any, then this might be sufficient. So let's just go ahead and leave it like that. And we'll go ahead and scribble out this and scribble out this, because we have now replaced those relationships.